The day Laurel Osibansu walked into that boardroom without a lawyer, half the room thought it was a joke. She stood at the door for a moment, just a moment, taking in the long mahogany table, the matching leather chairs, the framed portraits of company founders lining the wall like saints in a cathedral. 11 people already seated. 11 people who had already made up their minds. Her ex-husband Donovan sat at the head of the table, not because anyone had officially given him that seat, but because Donovan had always had a talent for occupying spaces that weren't his to claim. He was wearing the gray suit she'd bought him for their 5th anniversary. She noticed that immediately. She didn't let it show. Beside him sat Marguerite, his new partner, 2 years younger than Laurel, with the kind of confidence that comes not from having earned anything, but from having never been told no. Marguerite worked in the legal department. That's how it had started. That's how these things always started. Donovan looked up when Laurel walked in. Something crossed his face. Amusement, mostly. The kind of look a man gives when he already knows how the story ends. Laurel. He said her name like it was a mildly interesting fact. We weren't sure you'd come. I said I would, she replied, and took a seat near the middle of the table, away from him. Not at the end, not in a corner. The middle. She set her folder down without a sound. The meeting had been called to finalize the terms of the business dissolution. When Laurel and Donovan had married 8 years earlier, they had also built a company together. Norwood Consulting, a mid-sized firm out of Toronto, that specialized in municipal infrastructure contracts across Ontario and Quebec. She had been the one to write the first business plan. She had been the one to take out the second mortgage on her parents' house to get the capital together. She had been the one to cold call the city contacts, to fly to Ottawa on 3 hours' notice, to stay up until 2 in the morning running numbers while Donovan attended networking dinners and called it building relationships. None of that was on the table today. Today, according to Donovan's lawyer, a sharp, fast-talking man named Whitfield, who sat to Donovan's left with a yellow legal pad. Laurel was a minor shareholder who had been generously included in early operations but whose contribution to the company's current success was, quote, difficult to quantify. Difficult to quantify. She had written those words down when Whitfield first said them, 3 weeks earlier in a preliminary meeting. She had circled them twice. Then she had gone home to her rented apartment in Etobicoke, the one she'd moved into after leaving the house they'd shared in Rosedale, and she had sat at her kitchen table for a very long time. Then she had opened her laptop and gotten to work. People who knew Laurel before the marriage would tell you she had always been the quiet one. Not shy, not passive, quiet in the way that still water is quiet. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening beneath the surface where you can't see it. She had grown up in Scarborough, the second of 3 daughters born to Emmanuel and Adwoa Osibansu, both of whom had immigrated from Ghana in the late 80s. Her father had driven a cab for 11 years before getting his accounting designation. Her mother had worked as a personal support worker while finishing her nursing degree at night. The Osibansu household was not a place where anyone sat around waiting to be rescued. Laurel had studied finance at Ryerson, U of T now, she always had to remember to say, and then done a graduate certificate in public policy at Carleton. She had worked for 2 years at a consulting firm in Ottawa before moving back to Toronto, where she met Donovan at a fundraiser for a community health center in Cabottown. He had been charming. He had been funny. He had told her about his vision for a consulting firm that would do things differently, that would prioritize relationships over transactions. She had believed him. She had also brought the actual expertise that made any of it possible. For the first 3 years, the company was genuinely theirs. Long nights and early mornings and fights about invoice timelines, and arguments over contract language that always somehow ended with them laughing at themselves over takeout from the Thai place on Queen Street. She had loved that version of their life fiercely. She had thought it was permanent. It wasn't, of course. Nothing is. By year 5, the company was profitable. By year 6, Donovan had started spending more time at the office. By year 7, Laurel had started notice things, small things, the kind you explain away until you can't. A restaurant receipt for 2 on a Tuesday she thought he'd been in Mississauga. A text notification she wasn't meant to see. A change in the temperature of the room whenever she walked in. She didn't confront him dramatically. She wasn't that kind of person. She asked him, calmly, one evening in the kitchen. He denied it. She asked again 3 weeks later, with a little more information. He denied it again, less calmly. By the third conversation, he stopped denying it and started explaining why it was, in some complicated way she didn't fully follow, partially her fault. She had moved out 2 months later. She had not cried in front of him once. The divorce itself had been relatively clean, legally speaking. They had no children. The Rosedale house had been in Donovan's name, a decision they'd made years ago for tax purposes that she now understood had been a structural vulnerability she'd missed. Her personal assets were modest. Savings, a small RRSP, a car that was 3 years old. The company was the question mark. Norwood Consulting had grown significantly in the past 2 years. 2 major provincial contracts, a federal infrastructure grant, expansion into Quebec. It was now worth considerably more than it had been when their marriage ended. Donovan's position, argued consistently by Whitfield, was that this growth had occurred primarily under his leadership during a period when Laurel had already begun stepping back from day-to-day operations. That framing made Laurel's jaw tighten every time she heard it. She had stepped back because she had been systematically excluded. From meetings she hadn't been told about, from decisions made over dinners she hadn't been invited to, from a company she had helped build being quietly rerouted around her. She had been meant to take a small settlement and go quietly. She had agreed to today's meeting, attended without a lawyer, and sat in the middle of the table. Donovan had taken that as confirmation that she'd already accepted defeat. He didn't know what she'd been doing for the past 3 weeks. Whitfield opened the meeting with efficiency. He outlined the proposed terms. Laurel would receive a buyout of her remaining shares, calculated at a valuation from 18 months ago, before the provincial contracts, plus a modest additional amount described as recognition of early-stage contributions. Total figure, just over $200,000. For a company now conservatively valued at $14 million. Marguerite didn't say anything during this portion. She was there as Donovan's partner, not in her professional capacity, or so the fiction went. She sat with her hands folded on the table and occasionally leaned over to say something quietly to Donovan, who would nod. Laurel listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She made a note or two. When Whitfield finished, he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who expects the other person to simply say yes so everyone can go home. "Thank you," Laurel said. "Before we proceed, I'd like to table a few items." Donovan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Just slightly. She opened her folder. "The valuation you've referenced uses figures from the Q3 report of 2 years ago," she said. "I'd like to understand why, given that Norwood's current book of business has expanded significantly since that period, with 2 provincial contracts totaling approximately $8.4 million in billable work over the next 3 years, plus the federal infrastructure allocation announced last spring." Whitfield cleared his throat. "The valuation methodology, I've had the valuation methodology reviewed," Laurel said. She said it quietly, the way she said most things, by 2 independent assessors. "Would you like me to share their findings now or at the end?" A pause. "Now," said one of the other people at the table. Hansen, the company's CFO, a cautious man who had always been decent to her. He looked uncomfortable. She laid 3 pages on the table in front of her. Not enough for everyone, but enough. The current fair market value of Norwood Consulting, as assessed independently, falls between $12.8 and $15.2 million. The proposed settlement represents approximately 1.4% of that. "Laurel," Donovan began. "I'm not finished," she said, still quiet, not aggressive, just clear. She turned to the second item in her folder. "I'd also like to address the characterization of my role during the company's growth period." She referenced her notes without reading directly from them. "Between the time we incorporated and the end of our marriage, I was the primary author or co-author of the 4 largest contract proposals Norwood submitted. 3 of those were awarded. I managed the client relationship with the City of Hamilton, which renewed its contract twice and is currently in a 3rd renewal discussion. I also sourced and negotiated the partnership with Beaumont Infrastructure that enabled our Quebec expansion, an expansion that now accounts for roughly 30% of current revenue." Silence. Marguerite turned to say something to Donovan. He put his hand lightly on her arm. Not affectionately. More like, "Not now." "These contributions," Laurel continued, "are not difficult to quantify. I've quantified them." She slid a second document across the table. "This is a breakdown by contract and revenue impact, cross-referenced with internal project records and email correspondence." Whitfield looked at the document, then at Donovan, then back at the document. "Where did you get internal correspondence?" he asked. "I'm a shareholder," Laurel said. "I'm entitled to company records. I submitted the request 6 weeks ago through proper channels. It was slow-walked, but it was eventually fulfilled." She looked at Whitfield directly. "I have the record of the request and the date of fulfillment if that would be helpful." Another pause. Longer this time. Donovan leaned back in his chair. The amusement was gone from his face now. What Donovan hadn't known, what no one in that room had known, except Laurel, was that 3 weeks earlier, She had received a call from a woman named Sandra Park. Sandra Park was a partner at Creston Holdsworth Partners, a private equity firm based in Vancouver with significant operations in Toronto. Creston Holdsworth had been quietly watching Norwood Consulting for nearly a year. They were interested in acquiring a controlling interest. Sandra had called Laurel specifically, not Donovan, not Whitfield, not anyone else. Because in reviewing Norwood's corporate history, Creston's analysts had noticed something. The company's most significant contracts, its most durable client relationships, its most successful proposals, they all had a common thread. Not Donovan's name. Laurel's. We'd like to understand your current status with respect to the company. Sandra had said on that first call. And we'd like to understand your plans. Laurel had been sitting in her Etobicoke kitchen when she took the call. She had her notebook open in front of her, the one she used for grocery lists and occasional thoughts. She had written plans with a question mark. And then, slowly, she had started writing other things. Over the following weeks, she and Sandra Park had spoken 5 more times. On the last call, 2 days before the boardroom meeting, Sandra had made a formal statement on behalf of Creston Holdsworth. If Laurel remained a shareholder with meaningful equity in Norwood Consulting, Creston would be interested in discussing acquisition terms that recognized that equity. If Laurel was bought out for a nominal sum and her contributions erased from the record, Creston would be less certain about the underlying value of what they were acquiring. Sandra had been straightforward about it. The company Creston wanted to buy was, in significant part, the company Laurel had built. Without her, the story changed. Laurel had thanked her, asked for the conversation to be documented in writing, and then spent the next 48 hours preparing her folder. She didn't reveal any of this in the boardroom. Not yet. She didn't need to. What she did do, after laying out the valuation documents and the contribution analysis, was set a third item on the table. This one was a single page. She slid it to Whitfield. He read it. His expression was professionally controlled, but she watched his eyes move across the page twice. "What is this?" Donovan asked. "A letter of intent," Laurel said. "From a private equity firm that has been conducting due diligence on Norwood for the past 11 months. They've expressed interest in acquisition." She paused. "They've also expressed specific interest in the shareholder structure and the accurate representation of founding contributions in any deal documentation." The room was very quiet. Hansen, the CFO, was looking at her with something that might have been respect. You can't just." Donovan started and stopped. He looked at Whitfield. Whitfield set the page down carefully. "Mr. Norwood, I think we should take a short recess." "I don't need a recess," Donovan said. But his voice had a texture it hadn't had 20 minutes ago. Marguerite was no longer leaning over to say things in his ear. She was looking at the table. Laurel closed her folder and folded her hands on top of it. She had nothing else to add. She had said everything that needed to be said, and she had said it without raising her voice once. "I'm happy to continue," she said, "whenever everyone's ready." They took the recess anyway. Laurel went to the hallway and stood by a window that looked out onto Bay Street. It was a gray November morning, the kind Toronto does with a certain resigned expertise. Overcast but not raining. Cold enough to need a coat but not cold enough to be dramatic about it. People moved below on the sidewalk with their heads slightly down and their shoulders drawn in. She had grown up in this city. She had watched it change and stay the same in equal measure. She had once thought she would spend her whole adult life building something here alongside the person she loved. She didn't let herself be sad about that. Not here, not today. There would be time for that later, in the apartment in Etobicoke, with tea and her sister's voice on the phone. Right now she just looked at Bay Street and breathed. A colleague of Donovan's, a man named Forrest who ran business development, came out of the boardroom and walked past her. He slowed down. "I didn't know about the PE interest," he said quietly. Not an apology. Not quite. More like a man recalibrating. "No one did," she said. He nodded and kept walking. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When they reconvened, Whitfield had a different energy, still controlled but differently controlled. The legal pad was covered in notes now. Donovan was sitting in the same chair but held himself differently, like a man who has remembered that the chair does not actually belong to him. Whitfield proposed a counteroffer. It was better, significantly better, but it still wasn't right, and Laurel said so plainly. She pointed to 2 specific line items. One related to deferred equity provisions, one related to IP attribution on the contract templates she had authored, and explained why each needed adjustment. Whitfield asked for another 30 minutes to consult with his client. Laurel said she could give him 20. She didn't say it sharply. She said it the way someone states a bus schedule. It's just information. They settled in 17. The final terms were not everything she might have asked for in a perfect world. But they were fair. Genuinely fair. the kind of fare that stands up to scrutiny. Her equity position was reassessed at current valuation. Her founding contributions were formally documented in the corporate record. Her buyout figure was restructured accordingly, and a clause was added, at her insistence, and after some resistance, that her name would appear accurately in any future deal documentation, including, if it came to that, the Creston-Holdsworth transaction. Whitfield reviewed the revised terms with the care of a man who knows he has been outmaneuvered and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. He did not acknowledge it. He was professional about that, at least. Donovan signed without looking at her. 3 months later, Creston-Holdsworth completed its acquisition of Norwood Consulting. The press release, a short one, published in a business journal Laurel didn't usually read, named the founding partners of the firm. Her name was there. Accurate and complete. She read it once, set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, and went back to what she'd been doing. She was at the table with her laptop open, working on a proposal. She had spent the autumn laying groundwork for something new, smaller to start, but hers entirely. No shared equity, no negotiated contributions, no one else deciding what she had or hadn't brought to the table. A consulting practice focused on community infrastructure, the kind of work she had been best at, with a client list she had spent years cultivating. Her first contract had come through the week before. A mid-sized city in northern Ontario with an aging water treatment system and not enough internal capacity to manage the procurement process. The kind of problem she knew how to solve. She had called her mother to tell her about it. Her mother had listened, asked 3 precise questions about the financial structure, declared it sound, and then asked when Laurel was coming for dinner. Sunday, Laurel had said, "Good, I'll make jollof." It was, as endings go, quiet. No courtroom gallery, no dramatic moment of public reversal. Just a woman at a kitchen table in Etobicoke on a Tuesday evening, doing the work she'd just been good at, building something that couldn't be taken from her, and knowing, without needing anyone else to confirm it, exactly what she was worth.